Welcome to Millennial Development Goal number 8, Global Partnerships for Development. With this Millennial Development Goal established by the UN, they kind of broke that up into 5 different categories as far as things that they would focus on. First was development of further to open, develop further an open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading and financial system. Then address the special needs of least developed as well as landlocked countries. Then deal comprehensively with debt problems of developing countries. And then cooperate with pharmaceutical companies, providing access to affordable essential drugs. And then lastly, making available with private sector new tech, especially informational and communicational tech. Now, with Sudan, we have to kind of go with a background on the country to establish how we can best help them. And unfortunately, as you may have read in the previous segments, the background is kind of rough. Since the independence of Sudan in 1956, when Britain gave them full independence, North and South Sudan had many conflicts. They were pitted against each other, and because of that, once South Sudan seceded around 2006, there was so much disparity that they still had conflicts between each other as well as within their own countries. South Sudan being much worse as far as the inner turmoil than North Sudan, but there is still much strife within North Sudan, or this Republic of Sudan. And this first part about developing further an open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading and financial system is almost impossible because the government of Sudan is very corrupt. The only thing that's predictable at all about their economy is you can predict that the government will do what's best for them rather than what's necessarily best for the people. So as far as trading and having an open, rule-based, predictable, the rules that they set, they can change at any time because the government runs the show. And they are very discriminatory, being that Islam is the main religion in the country. Any peoples that may believe something different are treated less than those who are Islamic. And then just social status, people are just not treated and given fair opportunities in order to grow their own private sector jobs and things of that nature. So, unfortunately, 46% of the population in Sudan live below the poverty line due to a lack of assistance from the government, and they actually rank in the UNDP's 2004 Human Development Index survey. They actually rank 166th out of 187, meaning that there's only roughly 21 countries that are doing worse than they are. And once again, the conflict in Sudan is a major problem, hindering Sudan's progress. The disparity of peoples, both, we talked about it in the 7th development goal, that, the water issue with poor people not having very much access to that, and then also no access to natural resources as well as governmental resources, just continues to create that disparity that poor people feel towards the rich. Which further and further divides Sudan, making the government more and more unstable and marginalizing those individuals in the poor sector of the Sudan's socio-economic plot. And then Sudan also has lost, or because of that, their strife, a lot of the countries around them are a little uneasy, and they are all pulling for a united Sudan that's very stable, has a stable government, such as Ethiopia, such as China, India, who both have vested interest in the oil reserves that Sudan and South Sudan both have. as well as Kenya. Kenya is one of the neighboring countries, very much wanting Sudan to be very stable because they are their next door neighbors. They have a lot of their people who are seeking refuge, the refugees, are flooding into their land, so they need as much. They need Sudan to be as stable as possible, so that they're not overrun by the people of Sudan who are seeking refuge. But also, Egypt is very much worried about Sudan's stability, considering the fact that the Nile is their major source of water, and the Nile pretty much runs right through Sudan. So if Sudan further subdivides into any smaller countries, they might have inner conflicts between each other, where they might try to divert water into a different parts as to cut off water sources for maybe the people living further north, which would also impact Egypt highly, since once again the Nile is a huge play in their economy. So they all have vested interest in creating a stable Sudan, but until the government starts treating the people properly, the disparity is going to continue to increase, the strife and turmoil will continue, and those things may in the end happen. But another problem with Sudan is that they lost a lot of their GDP because of their oil was cut drastically when South Sudan seceded. They lost about 70% of their reservoirs of oil, and because of that, the government is no longer being funded. 95% of the exports prior to the succession of South Sudan was oil, and that was a major funder for the government. Not that the government was using that funding for anything proper. They were using that to fund themselves, give themselves money, and they didn't put any of that into the private sector to help people. They didn't put any of that into human development or diversifying the economy. And due to that, once again, further and further disparity between those in power and those rich individuals versus those that are poor and receive no help from the natural resources which are within Sudan's borders. The government is highly in debt currently. They are $45.1 billion in debt. Granted, it's not nearly as close to the U.S., but that's a side point. But they are in major debt considering their size and the population. They are, in fact, eligible for debt relief, which would coincide with that third portion, dealing comprehensively with debt problems for development countries. But once again, because the government is so corrupt and their greed has been in the past so severe, and they've spent money frivolously on stuff, they are not eligible for this relief, which is an act that was enacted for highly indebted poor countries to pretty much wipe clean their debt. But in order for them to qualify any more for that, they do need to give up, or they do need to comply with a lot of the things that they have set forth in order to receive that debt clearance. And then as far as global partnerships, there's a global partnerships for education that is working with Sudan to try and improve the public sector by improving education for all peoples in Sudan by supplying textbooks, improving learning environment, by supplying buildings and classrooms in rural areas where people might not have as much access to education. And they are actually funding about $76.5 million for this project, which should be completed in 2017. But it has lots of oversight with all that money. They are not letting the government touch any of it. They are taking care of all the funding themselves in helping the people of Sudan and furthering education. And then also the IMA World Health program is acting with companies like Pfizer, some other medical companies to bring supplies, medical supplies to Sudan for next to nothing, so that people can receive the things that they need. But until the government is a bit more stable, less corrupt, it's really hard for them to make any headway as far as getting more and more medical supplies, products, and things into the country without them being utilized for other things. So, once again, unfortunately, development goal number 8 has been a little bit stagnant for Sudan from the beginning of the millennial development goals. But once again, until the Sudan can solidify and become more of a cohesive country that's not so divided, without so much disparity, not much more headway can be made at this point. And that is Millennial Goal Development Goal number 8. Thanks for listening.